You're now listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.
Hello, Rockies. This is Sarah Jane Maroney, your host, and welcome to this week's interview with Mark Hillman, a Colorado native, a farmer, and recovering journalist. He was elected to 2 terms in the Colorado State Senate, serving 2 years as majority leader, and later served as state treasurer. In elected office, Mark was a leader in the fight to protect the rights of private property owners against governmental takings, halting frivolous lawsuits, and using choice and competition to improve options in education and healthcare. His commentaries have appeared in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Denver and Colorado Springs Gazettes, Denver Post, and RealClearPolitics.com. Mark and his wife Heidi have 2 sons and make their home in Burlington. He is a board member of the Leadership Program of the Rockies Independent Institute and the Colorado Thoroughbred Breeders Association. He's also served on his local Board of Education and Groundwater Management District Board. We welcome him. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here with you today. Thank you.
So, you have been a legislator, state treasurer, you've been around Colorado for a while, and you have the CCJL that was created, I think, in 2000. Tell me a little bit about that.
So, Colorado Civil Justice League is the only organization in Colorado that is focused exclusively on limiting unreasonable lawsuits. Our hallmark is common sense in the courtroom. And for us, that means justice for someone who has been injured by the wrongdoing of another, but it has to be balanced by fairness for defendants in civil lawsuits that have done nothing wrong. Because as anybody who's in Colorado today knows, just because you have done nothing wrong doesn't mean that you won't be sued. And so we're a nonpartisan organization. We've got members in manufacturing, automotive, energy, healthcare, insurance, construction, entertainment, finance, and a lot of small business members.
So, but how do you stop people from suing?
But you don't stop people from suing, but you have to have protections in the law, for example, that discourage, I like to say frivolous, some people say non-meritorious lawsuits. And that's what we used to have some good provisions in law to do that. There are still some, but there are less and less, and partly because the legislature loves to create new incentives for new lawsuits. And over the last 2 years in particular, they've introduced nearly 100 bills to create new opportunities to sue, and 50 or 51 of those, by my count, have passed.
Wow, that's quite a lot. In terms of, so you have lobbyists that go to the Capitol and try to influence the legislators?
Yeah, we do. We recognize that our members are busy earning a living and keeping businesses afloat. So part of what you get being a member of CCJL are lobbyists who will keep track of bills that are being introduced. We then let our members know if it's a bill that might be something that affects them directly. And then particularly if it does affect you as a business owner, as a family, as a property owner, as a landlord. That seems to be a popular topic in the last few years. If it affects you directly, then when those bills come up in front of a committee at the state legislature, we let our members know so that they can actually take a little bit of time out of their life and go testify at the Capitol and sit down at a table across from legislators, which is the cool part about committee hearings. You get to see them face to face and tell them, look, if you do this, this is what its effect is going to be on me or my family or my business.
And so in terms of that, you've been on both sides of the table. Do you feel like when you were a senator that you heard the same types of things that are coming up now, or is it different today?
Oh, it's different simply because the plaintiff's lawyers seem to feel empowered, and so many pieces of legislation, honestly, from both sides of the aisle, although might be from one side more than the other, but it's not an exclusive problem, have gone from requiring the executive branch, which we all know if you went to school and you learned about the separation of powers, the legislative branch passes the law, the executive branch enforces the law, and the judicial branch interprets or applies the law. So The way it should work is the legislature passes a law and says, if you're an employer, you can't do X, and then entrusts it to maybe the Department of Labor, some executive branch entity that is required to enforce it. The last few years, what has happened is they'll pass those types of laws, but they'll say, oh, and if you think that there's been a violation of this law, usually if you've been a victim, but not necessarily, sometimes you don't even have to be a victim, you can bring a lawsuit in district court for enforcement. And when they do that, they usually lard it up with things that we call magic damages. Magic damages mean damages that don't exist, except the legislature says that if there's a violation of this law, it's worth $5,000 per violation. Or non-economic damages. Those are damages for things that are intangible, like emotional stress, pain and suffering, loss of enjoyment of life, things that you and I can't sit down and pencil out what the actual cost is. We know there's a cost to it, but those two items are things that make it much more attractive for a plaintiff's lawyer working on a contingency fee to bring a lawsuit, because if their plaintiff actually did have a legitimate claim and damages, a contingency fee lawyer is in a position where their contingency fee comes out of the money that was actually due to the person who was harmed. But if we can add magic damages and emotional damages, then the contingency fee attorney can take his share mostly out of that. So it's sort of a win-win situation for both the plaintiff and the attorney. And just to circle back, why this is a bad problem in Colorado is, if we require enforcement through the executive branch, even if you don't like what the executive branch does, we're at least in a position where each executive branch agency develops sort of a specialty in handling their types of complaints. And so people that have to go and defend themselves with these agencies have a pretty good idea what to expect. They don't get that idea what to expect when they go into a court where the judge hears everything from murder charges to divorces to property disputes. And so there's less predictability. And then the last element that's lost when we go to enforcement by lawsuit is simply that the executive branch agencies at least have some accountability. They're accountable to whoever the governor is, and the governor ultimately gets voted upon by the people. But they're also accountable to the state legislature for their funding. And at least once a year, they have to go in front of both the budget committee at the legislature as well as the oversight committees in the House and the Senate, where they can be asked tough questions about how they're doing their job. And when you have enforcement through the courts, you lose all of that.
Just so our viewers know, we have a fabulous interview with Senator Kirkmeyer about what the JBC does and how all of that works. So make sure to catch that. So, okay, Mark, there was this particular session, and it seemed sort of convoluted to at least your average listener. There was a bill where the legislature was going to sue for Tabor, against Tabor, and use the taxpayers' money. Now, that was ultimately defeated, but it just seemed so jumping through hoops. And could you maybe take us through something like that?
Yeah, so while it's not an issue that was on CCJL's radar screen because we deal with Coloradans being sued, it certainly was another example of the legislature trying to accomplish what they want through the courts. And in that particular case, the legislature was jumping in to propose to ask the courts to nullify the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights in our Colorado Constitution. So it's in the Constitution because the voters of Colorado put it there, and it does a handful of things, but to encapsulate it in a few seconds, it gives taxpayers the right to vote on tax increases, and it also limits the growth of government to no more than population plus inflation. So it sort of ties it to economic growth. There have been ballot issues that have tried to repeal parts of that. There have been lawsuits brought by private individuals to try to repeal that. The sponsors of this particular piece of legislation believe that the legislature itself had special standing to bring that lawsuit, and the claim in the lawsuit is that allowing the people to limit the legislature's ability to spend money is a violation of the U.S. Constitution's guarantee that all 50 states will have a small r Republican form of government. Now, ironically, that lawsuit didn't contest any of the other hundreds of ballot issues that have passed that are in law that require the state to spend money on certain places. It only targeted the one issue where we tell the state there's a limit on how much of our tax dollars you can take.
That's a great, thank you. That was actually really helpful in terms of understanding, because you read it and you're trying to think, what's going on here? So that is very helpful. Thank you. So do you think, obviously you're going to say yes, but do you think CCJL is being successful? And does the makeup of the legislature, since you've been around for 20 years, affect the ability of CCJL to go forwards?
Well, the makeup of the legislature definitely affects the liability climate that we have in Colorado. I mean, CCJL has been successful at turning back a number of bills that would have made lawsuits in Colorado worse. We've also worked with a number of our allies in the business community to pass a few strategic bills to try to provide some protections. But it's certainly a change from what it was like when I was in the legislature, when Colorado was one of the top 10 states in the country for having the best civil justice climate. Civil justice, by the way, is the side of the court system that deals with disputes between people, as opposed to the criminal justice side, which obviously deals with crimes. Back in the early 2000s, even as recently as the early 2010s, Colorado was one of the top 10 states in the country based upon the U.S. Chamber of Commerce lawsuit climate survey. Then lawmakers began to pass more and more bills to expand liability, create new incentives for lawsuits. And in the last couple of years, both the U.S. Chamber and the American Tort Reform Association have both come out with different studies that show that the tort costs in Colorado are among the highest, the 10 highest in the country. So it's one of the 10 most expensive states for lawsuits. And those costs, they would both hasten to point out, are not costs that are just absorbed by business, because business has no choice but to pass it along either to their customers in the forms of higher prices, or their employees in the forms of foregoing raises, or foregoing updates to technology and equipment that would make them more productive.
So what would the solution be?
Well, we didn't get here overnight, so I'm not saying that there's a magic wand. There are a number of things that we could do. Back probably in the mid-2010s, when Texas was bragging about how they'd passed all these wonderful lawsuit reforms, a lot of the things that they passed, actually Colorado had at that time, and one of the most effective was an offer of settlement statute. And it wasn't loser pays, and there are some problems with loser pays, so CCJL doesn't advocate for a strict loser pays system, but the offer of settlement law that we used to have said essentially, you bring a lawsuit, and maybe you have a legitimate claim, but if at any point during the lawsuit, one side or the other makes an offer to settle the lawsuit, and that offer is rejected, then if the case goes on, if the defendant, if the business, for example, has offered a settlement, offered to pay a certain amount of money, the case goes on, and when it's over with, what the court awards is actually less than what the business offered. This offer of settlement statute said, hey, plaintiff, you have to pay the defendant's attorney fees and costs from that point forward, because you basically wasted their time and their money. And it made the same demand of a business. If a plaintiff said, hey, I'll settle for $250,000 in a $500,000 lawsuit, and the business rejected it, and the plaintiff went on to get more than that, in this case, the defendant would have to pay their attorney's fees from that point forward. So it had the virtue of being even-handed to both plaintiffs and defendants. It tried to encourage resolution of legitimate disputes rather than prolonged litigation. But that law was changed. I don't recall off the top of my head if it was changed through legislation or if it was changed by a court decision, so that now there are a lot of other factors that plaintiffs can include on their side of the equation, which means that they virtually never have to pay the defendant's attorney's fees and costs. And there was even a bill this year in the employment sector where employees can file claims for wages that they think they were owed and were not paid. And it still had one of those provisions in it on the offer of settlement, and it was changed from a very straightforward provision that again said if you receive less than you were offered, the other side has to pay you have to pay the other side's attorney's fees. It was changed to say that the employer can only recover legal expenses if the court finds that the employee pursued an action lacking substantial justification. And that's just vague and subjective, and it creates a playground for plaintiffs' attorneys to try to avoid ever having to pay the other side's attorney's fees, even in frivolous or non-meritorious cases.
Right now in the media, especially with President Trump, lawfare is thrown around as the term that is being used to defeat things, whether it's discontent with Elon Musk and Doge or against particularly President Trump or not. Do you think that that has increased overarchingly in America as well as Colorado specifically?
I think our entire culture is more litigation oriented, but that's only the case because our legislatures, Congress, and our courts allow it to be that way. You know, the purpose of a lawsuit, if you go and you look up tort reform, which is what we talk about, and people say, "What's a tort?" It sounds like something I order with my coffee at a coffee shop. A tort is basically an old legal term for a wrong, and so tort law is simply supposed to allow someone who has been harmed by the wrongdoing of someone else to be made whole, to recover their damages. The purpose of it is not to punish the other party. It's if you did something wrong and damaged somebody, you pay them for their damages as much as you possibly can do to make them whole. But the only time that it's used for punishment is when there's some extenuating circumstances or criminal behavior, and that's what we call punitive damages, which is why punitive damages also, when you buy insurance, the one thing it won't insure you for are punitive damages, because punitive damages involve some inherently either unlawful or malevolent behavior. But definitely, I mean, we live in a society where you can't turn on the TV or turn on the radio or drive down the road without seeing commercials, signs, billboards for plaintiffs' lawyers. And they're not putting those up because they're starving. They're putting those up because they're making a lot of money, and it's a very competitive industry.
In Colorado specifically and overarchingly, we have a lot of lawfare going on. We have a lot of frivolous lawsuits. Do you think that on the criminal side, and I know you're not dealing with that specifically, but that there has been a similar trend in using the courts, or the opposite?
You know, in Colorado, I don't think I see that on the criminal side, and I would certainly defer to a district attorney if he sees things differently. But while we don't follow those bills specifically, we have enough interaction with what goes on in the Judiciary Committee that I think if there was a great deal of evidence that our courts are being overcrowded by criminal complaints, that we would have brushed up against those at some point. And I'm simply not aware that it's a trend in Colorado in the state courts.
I guess I was wondering if it was a trend in the opposite direction. Essentially, one of the accusations leveled against Colorado is that they're letting criminals go free. And I'm just wondering if there's again, I understand that you don't specifically deal with criminal cases, but I was just saying in a trend in terms of laws and lawsuits, if that would have been the case.
Well, it certainly does appear, at least if I look at some of the things that have been written by, for example, District Attorney George Brockler, as well as other district attorneys, that the legislature increasingly tries to reduce criminal penalties, in part because some legislators don't believe that prisons actually rehabilitate or serve their purpose, and as a result, it does make it harder for district attorneys to, maybe not to prosecute, but to keep those people in jail once they're found guilty.
We do have an interview with George Brockler, so make sure to check that one out as well. So, Mark, tell me a little bit about your history. And obviously, you were a senator and state treasurer, but tell me, are you a Colorado native? And how did you come to a passion for civil justice?
Yeah, so I am a Colorado native, among the few and the proud, I guess. I've lived here all my life. In fact, I am fortunate to live on the farm where I grew up. So it's fun to raise your kids in the same area where you grew up. I was privileged to serve in the state senate from 1999 to 2005, and then as state treasurer in 2005 and 2006. And again, back then, that was when we were able to pass some of the cutting edge bills in the country to limit liability and to limit lawsuits. Colorado's definitely changed a fair amount since then. And I don't so much blame, people who have moved here who see things differently. I think increasingly in the last 10 years, we're just in a state where there are so many people who have moved here who didn't see what Colorado was like 15, 20, 25 years ago that they don't know what they're missing. And, there was a poll by the Colorado Polling Institute early this year that seemed to bear that out, that showed that people who have lived here for a longer period of time are much more concerned about the direction that Colorado is going than people who've lived here for, I think it was 20 years or less.
Okay, so going forwards, what would you say to your average citizen that says, I think there are probably a lot of lawsuits or I'm worried about my small business? Certainly you would encourage them to join. When I checked out the website, you can become a member for free. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the thing that I would definitely encourage is if any of your listeners have experience with a frivolous lawsuit, one thing you can do is go onto our website and there's a link that says, tell us your lawsuit story. Go on there and tell us what has happened to you. This is not because we can offer legal advice, but one of the most powerful tools that we have, and this happened a couple of years ago in a disability bill that was brought before the legislature to increase damages for violations of the Colorado Disabilities Act. We had store owners who came in and said, look, I received in the mail this lawsuit from somebody who had never been in my store. They listed all these things that supposedly I had done wrong, although they'd never been here. And then a few weeks later, miraculously, their lawyer says, we can make the whole claim go away for $15,000. That's powerful testimony, even for the legislators who tend to be pro-plaintiff, because it's real people sitting down at a table talking to them, telling them, this is my experience. And some of them actually, brought the paperwork with them. One of them brought their lawyer with them to back up what they were saying. So if you've got a lawsuit story to tell, that's powerful. And we would love to hear from that. Our website is ccjl.org. On that website, you can also learn more about what does it take to become a member. We've got an individual membership, which is a fairly economical rate. And then we've got more advanced memberships for larger businesses and corporations if they're interested as well. But definitely you can, and for that matter, if you have questions about what does Colorado Civil Justice League stand for, you can go onto our website, read our mission, and click on the link, send us an email, and I'll be happy to answer questions about what we do and where our interests may overlap.
So what do you think that the best, most powerful action or accomplishment that CCJL has done in its tenure of 25 years?
Oh gosh, that's a wide open question. Back in the day when Colorado was a leader, we passed bills, for example, that limited the ability of the attorney general to go out and hire private attorneys to represent the state on a contingency fee basis. You think back, if you're old enough to remember the old tobacco lawsuits, now it's some of these climate lawsuits where the attorney general basically signs a contract with a private attorney who then gets to take on the power and the authority of the state to go after somebody who's allegedly a bad actor. But that private attorney is usually going to receive 12.5% to 25% of what they win in court, which is supposed to be won on behalf of the state taxpayers. And we put limits on that so that attorneys' fees in those areas are capped, and they have to be very transparent with both the attorney general and the legislature about how many hours did you actually spend. I think that was one thing that was fairly significant. Back in at that time as well, we also established sensible remedies to home construction disputes that discouraged litigation, that made litigation a last resort. And of course, that's an ongoing problem in Colorado is on home affordability, especially for entry-level condos and townhomes. Nobody is building them now for the very simple reason that if you build a townhome or condo development, it is an absolute certainty that at some point you are going to be sued. And no insurance company is going to offer construction insurance if they know for certain that my policyholder is going to be sued, because that's a lose-lose. And so, not surprisingly, contractors have said, well, we can make more money building single-family homes. We can make more money building apartments that maybe at some time in the future could be turned into townhomes and condos. But for right now, it's more profitable for investors and more profitable for contractors to build apartments that people never get to own, all because our legislature won't take a firm step back and say, listen, you only get to sue under certain conditions when you actually suffered a loss. You don't get to sue, and this actually happens. You don't get to sue simply because studs or nails or something are a quarter inch off from what they were in the specifications, things that never affect the functionality of a home.
Do you think that could be an answer to our housing crisis that is currently happening? Affordable housing crisis?
Yeah, it would be a big help. I mean, this year there was a fairly modest bill passed that creates a fairly small program that's voluntary that contractors can sign up for when they start, that gives them some protections if they have a third party come in and basically do inspections to verify that they're following code and that sort of thing. But while that was a small step in the right direction, we won't know if it works for probably 5 or 10 years, because to begin with, I don't believe the bill is yet effective. So when it does, then you'll have to have somebody who maybe has a project that's not quite off the ground, who decides to comply with whatever the sign-up process is, builds it, which will take a few years, then people move in, and 5 or 10 years after that is when the lawsuits happen. So we won't know for 5 or 10 years, but I can tell you that if you would go back and roll back some of the bad laws that were passed in the mid-2000s and early 2010s that made it more lucrative for anybody to bring a lawsuit, that would encourage insurance companies to come back in and say, yeah, we can provide insurance for contractors who are building a good product. And we certainly do believe that if you bought a home and it's not what you expected, and you're the victim of poor construction, yes, you ought to be able to sue the contractor, and you ought to be able to recover damages. But again, we also believe that litigation ought to be the last resort after we try other ways to solve the problem and make your home livable.
So it sounds like CCJL is very balanced. It seems quite reasonable from my perspective as to what you're saying. Tell the people again where they can find you.
Sure. So we're Colorado Civil Justice League. Our webpage is CCJL.org. And on that page, you can find out what we're all about, how to contact us. You can tell us your lawsuit story. You can read some of the things that we've written about the last legislative session. And there's also an email link. So if you want more information about the organization, just go to ccjl.org and click on the email link as well.
Well, Mark, thank you. No idea that you existed. So I'm very appreciative of your insights. And as I said, it sounds like a really balanced way to go about things.
We find that in Colorado, voters typically appreciate balance, and that's why we have members that are from both political parties as well as unaffiliated. It's what has made us successful over the years, and is really what I think will make Colorado successful in the future if we can get back to striking some sort of a balance in this area as well as many others.
Thank you for listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.